All took part in the general conversation except Kitty and Levin. At first, when they were talking about the influence of one people over another, Levin recalled what he had to say on this subject, but his thoughts, which at one time had seemed to him very important, simply flashed through his mind like notions in a dream, and now had not the least interest for him. He even thought it strange that people could trouble themselves about such useless questions. Kitty, for her part, ought to have been interested in what was said about women's rights and education. How many times had she pondered over these subjects as she remembered her friend Varenka, whose dependence was so hard to bear? How many times had she thought what she herself would do in case she should not marry? How often had she disputed with her sister on the subject? But now it did not interest her in the least. She and Levin had their own talk, and yet it was not a conversation so much as it was a mysterious affinity, which brought them nearer and nearer to each other, and filled them with a joyful timidity before the unknown they were about to enter. At first Kitty asked how he happened to see her in the summer, and Levin told her that he was returning from the hayfields by the highway after the mowing. "It was very early in the morning. You had probably just waked. Your maman was asleep in her corner. It was a marvelous morning. I was walking along, saying to myself, 'A carriage with 4 horses. Whose can it be?' They were 4 fine horses with bells, and quick as a flash you passed by. I saw you through the door. You were sitting like this, holding the ribbons of your bonnet in your hands, and you seemed awfully deep in thought. How I wished I could know," he added with a smile, "what you were thinking about. Was it something very important?" "Wasn't my hair in disorder?" thought Kitty, but seeing the enthusiastic smile that lighted up Levin's face, she felt that on the contrary the impression she had produced was good, and she replied, blushing and laughing merrily, "Truly, I don't remember." "How heartily Tsarist laughs," said Levin, looking at his moist eyes and his sides shaking with laughter. "Have you known him long?" asked Kitty. "Who doesn't know him?" "And I see that you think he is a bad man." "Not bad, but he doesn't amount to much." "That is unjust. I beg you not to think so any more," said Kitty. "I, too, once had a very poor opinion of him, but he is a sweet-tempered and wonderfully good man. His heart is gold."
"How can you know what kind of heart he has?"
"We are great friends. I know him very well. Last winter, a short time after you were at our house," she said rather guiltily, but with a confiding smile, "Dolly's children had the scarlatina, and one day Tsarist happened to call on my sister. Would you believe it?" she said, lowering her voice. "He was so sorry for her that he stayed to take care of the little invalids. For 3 weeks he played nurse to the children. I am telling Konstantin Dmitrievitch of Tsarist's kindness at the time of the scarlatina," said she, turning to her sister. "Yes, it was remarkable. It was lovely," replied Dolly, looking with a grateful smile at Tsarist, who was conscious that they were talking about him. Levin also looked at him, and was surprised that he had never understood him till then.
"I plead guilty, and I will never again think ill of people," he said, gaily, speaking honestly, exactly as he thought at the time.
The discussion about the emancipation of women led to talk about the inequality of rights in marriage, and this was a ticklish subject to speak about in the presence of the ladies. Pestsov during the dinner several times touched on this question, but Sergey Ivanovitch and Stepan Arkadyevitch warily diverted him from it. But as soon as dinner was over and the ladies had retired, Pestsov addressed Alexey Alexandrovitch and attempted to explain the chief cause of this inequality. The inequality of rights between husband and wife in marriage depended, in his opinion, on the fact that the infidelity of a wife and that of a husband was unequally punished, both by law and by public opinion. Stepan Arkadyevitch hastened over to Alexey Alexandrovitch and offered him a cigar.
"No, I do not smoke," replied Karenina, calmly,
and as if to prove that he was not afraid of this conversation, he turned toward Pestsov with his icy smile.
"I imagine that such a view is based on the very nature of things," said he, and he started to go to the drawing room.
But here Tsarist suddenly spoke up, addressing Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Have you heard the story about Pryatchnikov?" he asked. He was animated by the champagne, and had been impatiently waiting for a chance to break a silence which weighed heavily upon him. "Vasya Pryatchnikov?" he repeated with a good-natured smile on his thick lips, red and moist, and he addressed Alexey Alexandrovitch as the most important guest. "I was told this morning that he fought a duel at Tver with Kavitsky and killed him." As it always seems as if a sore spot were peculiarly liable to be hit, so now Stepan Arkadyevitch thought the conversation was fated every moment to touch Alexey Alexandrovitch on the sore spot. He was on the point of going to his brother-in-law's assistance, but Alexey Alexandrovitch asked, with curiosity, "Why did Pryatchnikov fight a duel?" "On account of his wife. He behaved bravely about it. He challenged the other man and killed him." "Ah," said Alexey Alexandrovitch with unconcern, and, raising his eyebrows, he went to the drawing-room. Dolly met him in a little parlour leading into the drawing-room, and said, smiling timidly, "How glad I am that you came! I want to talk with you. Let us sit down here." Alexey Alexandrovitch, preserving the air of indifference caused by his elevated eyebrows, sat down near her, pretending to smile. "All the more willingly," said he, "as I wish to ask you to excuse me for leaving you as soon as possible. I have to go away tomorrow morning." Darya Alexandrovna was firmly convinced of Anna's innocence, and she was conscious of growing pale and trembling with anger before this heartless, unfeeling man, who coolly proposed to ruin her innocent friend. "Alexey Alexandrovitch," she said with desperate firmness, looking him full in the face, "I asked you about Anna, and you did not reply. How is she?" "I think that she is well, Darya Alexandrovna," replied Karenina, without looking at her. "Pardon me, I have no right to insist on it, but I love Anna like a sister. Tell me, I beseech you, what has happened between you and her, and what do you accuse her of?" Alexey Alexandrovitch frowned and bent his head, almost closing his eyes. "Your husband must have told you, I think, the reasons which oblige me to break my relations with Anna Arkadyevna," said he, avoiding her eyes but casting a glance of annoyance at Shtcherbatsky, who was passing through the room. "I do not believe it. I do not believe it, and I cannot believe it," murmured Dolly, pressing her thin hands together energetically. She rose quickly and, touching Alexey Alexandrovitch's arm, said, "We shall be disturbed here. Let us go in there, please." Dolly's emotion communicated itself to Alexey Alexandrovitch. He arose and submissively followed her into the children's schoolroom. They seated themselves at a table covered with an oilcloth, hacked with penknives. "I don't believe it. I don't believe it," repeated Dolly, trying to catch his eye, which avoided hers. "One cannot deny facts, Darya Alexandrovna," said he, dwelling on the word facts. "But what has she done?" insisted Darya Alexandrovna. "Precisely what has she done?" "She has failed to do her duty, and been false to her husband. That is what she has done," said he. "No, no, it is impossible. No, thank the Lord, you are mistaken," cried Dolly, putting her hands to her temples and closing her eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled coldly with his lips only. He wished to prove to Dolly, and to prove to himself, the firmness of his conviction, but this heated defense of his wife, though it did not shake him, irritated his wound. He spoke with more animation. "It is difficult to make a mistake when a woman herself declares to her husband that 8 years of married life and a son count for nothing, and that she wishes to begin life over again," he repeated angrily, dilating his nostrils. "Anna and vice! I cannot associate the two ideas. I cannot believe it." "Darya Alexandrovna," said he, angrily, now looking straight at Dolly's distressed face, and feeling his tongue involuntarily unloosed, "I would give a great deal to be able still to have any doubts. When I was in doubt about it, it was hard for me, but easier than it is now. When I doubted, there was still hope. Now there is no hope, and I have doubted everything. I am so full of doubt that I detest my son, and sometimes I do not believe that he is my son. I am very unhappy." He had no need to say that. Darya Alexandrovna understood it as soon as she looked into his face. She pitied him, and her faith in her friend's innocence was shaken. "Oh, it is terrible, terrible! But is it true that you are really decided about the divorce?" "I have decided to take this last measure. There was nothing else for me to do." "No, don't do it. Don't do it," cried Dolly, with tears in her eyes. "No, don't do it." "The most dreadful thing about a misfortune of this kind is that one cannot bear his cross as in any other, a loss or a death. And here one must do something," said he, apparently divining Dolly's thought. "One must escape from the humiliating position in which one is placed. On ne peut vivre à trois." "I understand perfectly," replied Dolly, bowing her head. She was silent, thinking of herself, of her own domestic troubles. But suddenly, with an energetic movement, she raised her head, and with a supplicating gesture she folded her hands. "But wait," she said. "You are a Christian. Think of her. What will become of her if you abandon her?" "I have thought of it, Darya Alexandrovna. I have thought a great deal about it," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. His face was covered with red blotches, and his troubled eyes looked straight at her. Darya Alexandrovna pitied him now from the bottom of her heart. "I did this very thing after she herself told me of her disgrace. I put everything on the old footing. I gave her the chance of reformation. I tried to save her. What did she do then? She paid no attention to the easiest of demands, observance of propriety," he added, choking. "One can save a man who does not want to perish, but if his whole nature is so corrupt, so rotten, that ruin itself seems salvation, what can be done?" "Everything except divorce," replied Darya Alexandrovna. "What do you mean by everything?" "No, that is horrible. She will no longer be anyone's wife. She will be lost." "What can I do?" replied Karenin, raising his shoulders and his eyebrow. And the memory of his wife's last offence so angered him that he became as cool as at the beginning of the conversation. "I am very grateful to you for your sympathy, but I must go," he added, rising. "No, wait a moment. You must not give her up. Listen to me. I speak from experience. I, too, was married, and my husband deceived me. In my jealousy and indignation I wished to abandon everything, but I considered the matter, and who saved me? Anna. Now I am living again. Now my children are growing up. My husband has returned to his family, regrets his wrongdoing, is growing better, nobler. I live. I have forgiven him, and you ought to forgive her." Alexey Alexandrovitch listened, but Dolly's words had no effect on him. Again in his soul arose the anger of that day when he decided on a divorce. He shook himself and spoke in a loud, penetrating voice. "I cannot, nor do I wish to forgive her. It would be unjust. I have done what was next to impossible for this woman, and she has trampled everything into the mire, which seems to be her element. I am not a bad man, and I have never hated anybody before, but her I hate with all the strength of my soul, and I cannot forgive her, for I hate her too much for all the wrong she has done me," and tears of anger trembled in his voice. "Love them that hate you," murmured Dolly, almost ashamed. Alexey Alexandrovitch smiled scornfully. He was familiar with these words, but they did not apply to his case. "We can love those who hate us, but to love those whom we hate is impossible. I beg your pardon for having troubled you. Sufficient unto every man is his own burden." And having recovered his self-possession, Alexey Alexandrovitch calmly took leave of Dolly and went away. When the company arose from dinner, Levin wanted to follow Kitty into the drawing-room, but he was afraid, not that it would be disagreeable to her, but that it would be too obvious a wooing of her. So he remained with the men, and took part in the general conversation. and without looking at Kitty he was conscious of her motions, of her glances, and of the place where she was in the drawing-room. Without the least effort he immediately began to fulfill the promise that he had made to her to love all men, and to think nothing but good of them. The conversation turned on the Commune in Russia, which Pestov considered as the beginning of what he called a new order of things. Levin agreed as little with him as he did with Sergey Ivanovitch, who it seemed to him recognized, and at the same time denied, the value of this institution. But he talked with them, trying only to reconcile them and tone down their excitability. He was not in the least interested in what he himself said, and was still less interested in what they said, but his one desire was to see all of them happy and contented. He now realized what one thing was important, and that one was at first yonder in the drawing-room, and afterward moved about and was now near the door. Without turning around he was conscious of a look and a smile fixed on him, and he could not help looking. She was standing there with Shtcherbatsky and looking at him. "I thought you were going to the piano," said he, approaching her. "Music is what I have to do without in the country." "No, we merely came to find you, and I thank you for coming to us," she replied, recompensing him with a smile. "What pleasure can there be in discussing? Really, no one ever convinced another." "Yes, that is true," said Levin. "It generally happens that you get excited in a discussion simply from the fact that you can never tell exactly what your opponent is trying to show." Levin had many times noticed that in discussions among clever people, after an immense output of energy, an immense array of logical terms and subtleties, the disputants came at last to an acknowledgment that what they had been so interminably striving to prove to each other was a matter of common knowledge from the very beginning, but that they liked something different, and therefore were not willing to acknowledge what they liked, so as not to be controverted. He had often met with the experience that in the midst of a dispute you find what your opponent likes, and suddenly you find that you yourself like the same thing, and you immediately agree, and then all your arguments fall to the ground as useless. But sometimes he had had the opposite experience. You at last say what you like and evolve your arguments, and if perchance you speak well and sincerely, suddenly your opponent assents and ceases to uphold the other side. This is exactly what he meant. She wrinkled her brows trying to comprehend, but as soon as he began to explain, her mind grasped his meaning. "I understand. One must make sure why he is disputing, what he likes, if possible." She had fully grasped and expressed his badly phrased idea. Levin smiled with rapture, so striking was the transition from the complicated prolix discussion between Pestov and his brother to this clear, laconic, almost wordless communication of the most abstruse thoughts. Shtcherbatsky stepped away, and Kitty, going to a card table, sat down, and taking a piece of chalk in her hand, began to draw circles on the green cloth. They took up the topic which was under discussion at dinner, as to the emancipation and occupation of women. Levin was inclined to agree with Darya Alexandrovna that a girl who was not going to marry would find feminine occupations in some family. He urged that not a single family can get along without some female help, that every family, however poor or rich, has and must have someone to look after the children. "No," said Kitty, blushing, but looking at him frankly with her honest eyes. "A girl may be so situated that she cannot without humiliation go into a family, but she herself—" He understood what she hinted at. "Oh, yes," he said. "Yes. Yes. Yes, you are right." And he realized all that Pestov was trying to prove at dinner about the freedom of women, merely by the fact that he saw in Kitty's heart a maiden's dread of humiliation, and loving her, he experienced this dread and this humiliation, and immediately renounced his former arguments. A silence ensued. She went on making designs with the chalk on the table. Her eyes shone with a gentle gleam. Submitting to her mood, he felt in his being all the increasing tension of happiness. "Oh, I have covered the table with my scrawls," said she, laying down the chalk, with a movement as if she were going to rise. "How can I stay alone without her?" thought Levin, terrified, and picking up the chalk. "Wait," said he, sitting down at the table. "I've wanted for a long time to ask you something." He looked straight into her affectionate but nevertheless startled eyes. "Please, what is it?" "This is it," he said, taking the chalk and writing the letters WYS III WIITOA. These letters were the initials of the words, "When you said it is impossible, was it impossible then or always?" It was not at all likely that Kitty would be able to make out this complicated question. Levin looked at her, nevertheless, as if his life depended on whether she would guess these words or not. She looked at him gravely, then rested her forehead on her hand and tried to decipher it. Occasionally she would look up at him, asking him with her eyes, "Is what I think right?" "I know what it is," she said, blushing. "What is this word?" he asked, pointing to the I of the word impossible. "That letter stands for impossible. The word is not right," she replied. He quickly rubbed out what he had written, gave the chalk to her and stood up. She wrote TICNAD. Dolly, seeing her sister with the chalk in her hand, a timid and happy smile on her lips, raising her eyes to Levin, who was leaning over the table, beaming now at her, now at the cloth, felt consoled for the grief caused by her conversation with Alexey Alexandrovitch. Her face suddenly grew radiant. He had understood the reply. Then I could not answer differently. He looked at Kitty timidly and inquiringly. "Only then?" "Yes," replied the young girl's smile. "BN, but now?" he asked. "Read this. I will tell you what I wish very much." And she quickly traced the initials TYMFAFWTP. This meant, "that you might forgive and forget what took place." He seized the chalk in turn with his excited, trembling fingers, and crushing it wrote down the initials of these words, "I have nothing to forgive and forget. I have never ceased to love you." Kitty looked at him, and her smile died away. "I understand," she murmured. He sat down and wrote a long phrase. She comprehended it, and without even asking it is thus and so, took the chalk and instantly replied. It was some time before he made out what she wrote, and had to keep looking into her eyes. His wits were dulled by his happiness. He could not supply the words which she intended, but in her lovely eyes, radiant with joy, he understood all that he needed to know. And he wrote 3 letters. But he had not finished writing them ere she read them under his hand and herself finished the sentence and answered it, "Yes." "You are playing secrétaire, are you?" said the old prince, coming up to them. "Well, if you are going to the theatre, it is time to start." Levin rose and accompanied Kitty to the door. This conversation decided everything. Kitty had acknowledged her love for him, and had given him permission to come the next morning to speak to her parents. After Kitty had gone and Levin was left alone, he felt such a restlessness and such an unendurable longing for the morning to come when he might see her again and settle his destiny forever, that he dreaded, as he dreaded death, the 14 hours which he should have to endure without her. He felt it absolutely necessary to be with and to talk with some one so as not to remain alone, so as to cheat the time. Stepan Arkadyevitch, whom he would have liked to keep with him, was going, so he said, to a reception, but in reality to the ballet. Levin could only tell him that he was happy, and should never, never forget what he owed to him. Stepan Arkadyevitch's eyes and smile showed Levin that he suitably appreciated his feelings. "What? Then you have nothing more to say about dying?" said Oblonsky, pressing his friend's hand affectionately. "No," replied the latter. Darya Alexandrovna, too, almost congratulated him when she bade him good night. She said, "How glad I am that you have made up with Kitty. We ought to prize old friends." And her words displeased Levin. She could not comprehend how lofty and inaccessible to her all this was for him, and she should not have dared to refer to it. Levin took his departure, but, to avoid being alone, he joined his brother. "Where are you going?" "To a meeting." "Well, I'll go with you. May I?" "Why not?" said Sergey Ivanovitch, smiling. "What has happened to you today?" "What has happened? Good fortune," said Levin, letting down the carriage window. "Have you any objection? I'm suffocating. Good fortune has happened to me. Why have you never been married?" Sergey Ivanovitch smiled. "I am delighted. She seems like a splendid he began. "No, don't say anything about it. Don't say anything about it," cried Levin, clutching the collar of his shuba with both hands and covering his face with the fur. A splendid girl! What commonplace words! And how feebly they corresponded to his feelings. Sergey Ivanovitch laughed a gay laugh. This was a rare occurrence with him. "I should think I might say that I am very glad of this." Tomorrow you may speak, but not another word now. Not another word. Not another word. Be silent," said Levin, and pulling his shuba still higher round his face, he added, "I love you very much. But tell me, may I go to your meeting?" "Of course you may." "What is the subject for your discussion tonight?" asked Levin, still smiling. They reached their destination. Levin heard the secretary stammer through the report, which evidently he did not understand, but he could see, from this secretary's face, that he was a good, amiable, sympathetic fellow. It was evident from the way he hesitated and became confused while reading. Then came the debates. They discussed about the disposal of certain sums of money and the laying of certain sewer pipes. Sergey Ivanovitch attacked two members of the commission, and made a long, triumphant speech against them. After which another member, reading from a paper, after some timid hesitation, replied briefly in a charming though bitter fashion, and then Sviazhsky, he too was there, in his turn expressed his opinions nobly and eloquently. Levin listened and clearly saw that neither the money to be expended nor the sewer pipes were of serious importance, and that they were not really quarreling, but were all such pleasant, congenial people, and consequently all was serene among them. They interfered with no one, and all seemed happy. Levin noticed with surprise that they all seemed to him to-day transparent, that, from some trifling incidents which once would have entirely escaped his notice, he could read their souls, and see how good they all were. Especially did they seem to like him, Levin. This was shown by the way they talked with him, and even those who did not know him looked at him pleasantly and in a friendly manner. "Well, how did you like it?" asked Sergey Ivanovitch. "Very much. I never should have believed that it would be so interesting. It is splendid." Sviazhsky approached Levin and invited him to come and take a cup of tea at his house. Levin could not for the life of him comprehend or remember why he had been prejudiced against Sviazhsky, or what he had seemed to him to lack. He was a clever and wonderfully good fellow. "I should be delighted," replied Levin, and he immediately inquired after Madame Sviazhsky and her sister. By a strange association of ideas, as Sviazhsky's sister-in-law suggested marriage, he concluded that nobody would be more interested than she and her sister to hear of his happiness, so he was very much pleased with the idea of going to see them. Sviazhsky questioned him about his affairs, always refusing to admit that anything could be discovered which had not already been discovered in Europe. But now his theory did not arouse Levin's opposition. On the contrary, he felt that Sviazhsky was right, and Levin admired the gentleness and delicacy with which he avoided the expression of his arguments. The ladies were especially charming. It seemed to Levin that they all knew, and that they shared his joy, but that they avoided speaking of it from discretion. He remained for 3 hours, talking on various subjects, and continually alluding to what filled his soul, without noticing that he was mortally tiring his friends, and that they were falling asleep. At last, Sviazhsky, yawning, accompanied him to the vestibule, very much surprised at the strange state of mind in which his friend seemed to be. It was 2:00. Levin reached his hotel and was aghast at the thought of passing the next 10 hours alone, a prey to his impatience. The watchman who was on duty in the corridor lighted his candles, and was about to withdraw when Levin stopped him. This fellow, who was called Yegor, and whom Levin had never before noticed, seemed like a good, intelligent man, and above all, kind-hearted. "Tell me, Yegor, don't you find it hard to go without your sleep?" "What can I do about it? It is our calling. We have an easier time in gentlemen's houses, but here we get larger wages." It seemed that Yegor was the father of a family of 4 children, 3 boys and a girl trained as a seamstress, whom he hoped to marry to a harness maker's clerk. Levin seized this opportunity to communicate his ideas about love in marriage to Yegor, remarking that people are always happy when there is love, because their happiness is in themselves. Yegor listened attentively and evidently understood Levin's meaning, but he confirmed it by an unexpected reflection, that when he, Yegor, had served good masters, he had always been satisfied with them, and that he was contented with his master now, although he was a Frenchman. "What a wonderfully good fellow," thought Levin. "Well, and did you love your wife, Yegor, when you married her?" "Why shouldn't I have loved her?" replied Yegor. And Levin noticed Yegor also grew very enthusiastic and was eager to confide to him his inmost thoughts. "My life, too, has been extraordinary," he began, his eyes shining, overcome by Levin's enthusiasm as one catches a yawning fit. "From my childhood—" But the bell rang. Yegor departed, and Levin was left alone. He had eaten scarcely anything at dinner. He had refused to take any tea or supper at Sviazhsky's, yet even now he could not think of eating. He had not slept the preceding night, yet he did not think of sleeping now. His room was cold, but it seemed so stifling that he could not breathe. He opened both casements and sat down on a table in front of one. Above the roofs, covered with snow, rose the carved cross of a church, and higher still were the triangular constellation of the charioteer and the bright yellow capella. He breathed in the cold air which filled his room, and looked now at the cross, and now at the stars, rising as in a dream among the figures and memories called up by his imagination. Toward 4 o'clock in the morning he heard footsteps in the corridor. He opened his door and saw a gambler named MaryAnn, whom he knew, returning from his club. He walked along, coughing, gloomy and scowling. "Poor unfortunate fellow," thought Levin, and his eyes filled with tears of pity and love for that man. He wanted to stop him, to speak to him and console him, but, remembering that he was undressed, he thought better of it, went back and sat down to bathe himself in the icy air, and to look at the silent, foreign-looking cross, so full of meaning to him, and at the brilliant yellow star poised above it. Toward 7 o'clock the men polishing the floors began to make a noise. The bells rang for early morning service, and Levin began to feel that he was taking cold. He closed the window, made his toilet, and went out. The streets were still deserted. Levin walked to the Shtcherbatskys' house. The principal entrance was still closed, and everyone was asleep. He returned to the hotel, went to his room, and asked for coffee. The day watchman, and not Yegor, brought it to him. Levin wished to enter into conversation with him, but someone rang for him, and he went out. Then Levin tried to take his coffee, and put a piece of kalach into his mouth, but his mouth did not know what to do with the bread. He eschewed it and put on his overcoat, and went out to walk again. It was just 10 o'clock when he reached the Shtcherbatskys' steps for the second time. They were beginning to get up. The cook was going to market. He would have to wait at least 2 hours longer. Levin had passed the whole night and the morning completely oblivious of the material conditions of existence. He had neither eaten nor slept, had been exposed, with almost no clothing, to the cold for several hours, and he not only was fresh and hearty, but he was unconscious of his body. He moved without using his muscles, and felt capable of doing anything. He was persuaded that he could fly through the air or jump over the top of a house if it were necessary. He roamed about the streets to pass away the time, consulting his watch every moment or two, and looking about him. What he saw that day he never saw again. He was particularly struck by the children on their way to school, the dark blue pigeons flying from the roof to the sidewalk, the sacks or little cakes powdered with flour that an invisible hand was arranging in a window. These cakes, the pigeons, and the 2 little lads were celestial objects. All this happened at once. One of the little lads ran toward a pigeon and looked at Levin, smiling. The pigeon flapped its wings and flew off glittering in the sunlight through a cloud of fine snow, and the smell of hot bread came through the window where the sacks were displayed. All these things, taken as a whole, produced so lively an impression on Levin that he laughed aloud until the tears came. After going round by the Gazetnya and Kislova streets, he went back to the hotel, sat down, placed his watch before him, and waited till the hands pointed to the hour of noon. In the next room someone was talking about machines and hoaxes, and someone coughed a morning cough. The person did not know that the hour hand was approaching 12. The hour pointed to 12. Levin went to the steps of the hotel. The izvoschiks evidently knew all about it. With happy faces they surrounded him, with eager emulation offering their services. Striving not to offend the others and promising to take them some other time, he made his choice and ordered the man to drive to the Shtcherbatskys'. The izvoshchik was charming, with his white shirt-collar above his kaftan surrounding his strong red neck. He had a comfortable sleigh, more comfortable than ordinary sleighs, such a sleigh as Levin had never seen before, and the horse was good and did his best to run, but did not stir from the spot. The izvoshchik knew the Shtcherbatsky house. He stopped before the door flourishing his arms and turned respectfully toward Levin, saying "Tpru" to his horse. The Shtcherbatskys' Swiss knew all about it, surely. That was plain from the look in his eyes and the way he said, "Well, it is a long time since you have been here, Konstantin Dmitrich." Not only did he know what had happened, but he was full of delight and tried to conceal his joy. Levin felt a shade happier when he caught the old man's good-natured eyes. "Are they up?" "Please come in. Leave that here," added the Swiss, as Levin was turning back to get his cap. That surely had some significance. "To whom shall I announce you, sir?" asked a lackey. This lackey, though young, new in the house, and with some pretension to elegance, was very obliging, very attentive, and he, too, seemed to understand the situation. "To the princess. I mean the prince. No, the young princess," replied Levin. The first person whom he met was Mademoiselle Linon. She was passing through the hall, radiant in her little curls and her shining face. He had hardly spoken to her when the rustling of a dress was heard at the door. Mademoiselle Linon disappeared from before his eyes, and a joyous trepidation at the thought of the happiness so near took possession of him. Mademoiselle Linon hastened away and vanished through another door. She had hardly gone when swift light steps were heard pattering on the inlaid floor, and his happiness, his life, the better part of himself, that which he had yearned for so long, drew near. She did not walk, some invisible power seemed to bring her toward him. He saw only her bright, truthful eyes, filled with the same timid joy of love that filled his own heart. These eyes, shining nearer and nearer to him, almost blinded him with their light of love. She stood before him, almost touching him. Then she placed her two hands gently on his shoulders. She did all she could. She went to him. She gave herself to him, trembling and happy. He folded her in his arms, and pressed his lips to hers, expectant of his kiss. She, too, had not slept at all that night. She had been waiting for him all the morning. Her parents were perfectly agreed and happy in her happiness. She had been on watch for his coming. She wanted to be the first to tell him of their happiness. She was prepared to meet him alone, and she was full of joy at the thought, and yet she was shy and confused, and hardly knew what she was going to do. She had heard his steps and voice, and hid herself behind the door to wait till Mademoiselle Linon had gone. Mademoiselle Linon went. Then, without any delay, without questioning further, she came to him and did as she did. "Now, let us find mamma," said she, taking his hand. For a long time he could not utter a word, not so much because he was afraid of lessening the intensity of his joy by words, but because every time he tried to say anything he felt that instead of words, tears of joy burst forth. His tears choked him. He took her hand and kissed it. "Is it really true?" he said at last in a husky voice. "I cannot believe that you love me." She smiled at the way he used the second person singular, and at the timidity with which he looked at her. "Yes," she replied, slowly lingering on this word. "I am so happy." Without letting go his hand, she went with him into the drawing-room. As soon as the princess saw them, she began to breathe fast, and then burst into tears, and then she laughed, and with an energetic movement which Levin was not prepared for, she ran to him, seized his head, and kissed him, bedewing his face with her tears. "So all is settled? I am delighted. Love her. I am so glad. For you, Kitty." "It didn't take you long to arrange matters," said the old prince, trying to appear calm, but Levin saw his eyes were full with tears as he looked at him. "It is something I have long been anxious for," said the prince, taking Levin's hand and drawing him toward him. "And even when this little giddy pate thought—" "Papa!" cried Kitty, putting her hand over his mouth. "Well, I won't say anything," said he. "I am very, very ach, how stupid I am!" And he took Kitty in his arms, kissed her face, her hands, and then her face again, blessing her with the sign of the cross. And Levin was filled with a new feeling of affection for the old prince, when he saw how tenderly and fervently Kitty kissed his great, strong hand. The princess was sitting in her easy chair, silent and beaming. The prince was sitting beside her. Kitty was standing near her father, holding his hand. All of them were silent. The princess was the first to bring their thoughts and feelings back to the affairs of real life, and the transition gave each of them, for a moment, a strange and painful impression. "When shall the wedding be? We must announce the marriage, and have them betrothed, but when shall the wedding be? What do you think about it, Alexander?" "There is the person most interested," said the prince, pointing to Levin. "When?" replied the latter, reddening. "Tomorrow, if you wish my opinion. Today, the betrothal. Tomorrow, the wedding." "There, that'll do, mon cher. No nonsense." "Well, in a week then." "One would really suppose that you had lost your senses." "But why not?" "Mercy on us," said the mother, smiling gaily at his impatience. "And the trousseau?" "Is it possible that a trousseau and all the rest are indispensable?" thought Levin, with alarm. "However, neither the trousseau, nor the betrothal, nor anything else can spoil my happiness. Nothing can do that." He looked at Kitty, and noticed that the idea of the trousseau did not offend her at all. "It must be very necessary," he said to himself. "I admit that I know nothing about it. I have merely expressed my desire," said he, excusing himself. "We will consider the matter. Now we will have the betrothal, and announce the marriage. That is what we will do." The princess stepped up to her husband, kissed him, and was about to move away again, but he held her, and kissed her again and again, like a young lover. The two old people seemed agitated, and ready to believe that it was not their daughter who was to be married, but themselves. When the prince and princess had gone out, Levin approached his fiancée and took her hand. He had regained his self-possession and could speak. He had many other things on his mind to tell her, but he did not say at all what he intended to say. "I knew that it would be like this. At the bottom of my heart I was sure of it, without ever daring to hope. I believe that it was predestined." "And I," replied Kitty, "even when—" she hesitated, then continued, looking at him resolutely out of her sincere eyes, "even when I rejected my happiness. I never loved anybody but you. I was led away. I ought to tell you. I must ask you. Can you forget it?" "Perhaps it was best that it should be so. You, too, will have to pardon me, for I must confess to you—" This was one of the things he had on his mind to tell her. He had decided to confess everything to her, from his earliest life. First, that he was not so pure as she, and then that he was not a believer. This was cruel, but he thought it his duty to make these confessions to her. "No, not now. Later," said he. "Very well, later. But be sure to tell me. I am not afraid of anything. I want to know all, everything, now it is decided." "Is it decided," he interrupted, "that you take me just as I am? You do not take back your word?" "No, oh no." Their conversation was interrupted by Mademoiselle Linon, who, trying to look properly serious, came to congratulate her favorite pupil. She had not left the drawing-room before the servants came to offer their congratulations. Next came the relatives and friends, and this was the beginning of that absurdly happy period from which Levin did not emerge till the day after his marriage. Although he felt constrained and ill at ease all the time, Yet the force of his happiness kept increasing. He felt all the time that much which he knew nothing about would be required of him, and he did everything that he was told to do, and all this served to increase his joy. He imagined that his engagement would not be in the least like others, that the ordinary conditions of an engagement would destroy his especial happiness. But it came about that he did exactly as everybody else did in such cases, and his happiness for this very reason kept increasing, and grew more and more peculiar, and did not change, and was in no respect like that of other men. "Now," said Mademoiselle Linon, "we shall have all the candy we wish for." And Levin ran to buy candy. "Well, very glad," said Sviazhsky. "I advise you to get your bouquets at Fomin's." "Do you?" said Levin, and he went to Fomin's. His brother told him he would have to borrow money because there would be many expenses for presents and other things. "For presents? Really?" And he started off on the run to buy jewelry at Fulda's. At the confectioner's, at Fomin's, at Fulda's, he found that every one expected him, and every one seemed glad and rejoiced in his happiness, as did every one with whom he had to do those days. It was an extraordinary thing that not only did they all love him, but, strange as it may seem, even those who before had seemed cold, unsympathetic, and indifferent approved of him in every way, treated his feelings with delicacy and gentleness, and shared his convictions that he was the happiest man in the world, because his bride was the pink of perfection. Kitty also had the same feeling. When the Countess Nordstone alluded to the more brilliant hopes that she had conceived for her friend, Kitty became angry, and declared so vehemently that no one in the world could be better than Levin, that the countess had to confess it, and when Kitty was present she never met Levin without smiling enthusiastically. The confession which he had promised was a very trying incident of this period. He consulted the old prince, and, acting on his advice, Levin gave Kitty his journal in which were written out all the matters that troubled him. He had written this diary purposely to show to the one whom he should marry. 2 things tormented him: his sins against virtue and his unbelief. The confession of his unbelief passed almost unnoticed. She was religious, and had never doubted the truths of her religion, but her lover's superficial skepticism did not trouble her very much. She knew through love his whole soul, and in his soul found all that she wanted. It was of little importance to her that he termed the state of his soul incredulity. But the second acknowledgment caused her to shed bitter tears. Levin had a great struggle with himself before he decided to let her read his diary. He knew that between him and her there could be and should be no secrets, and therefore he resolved that he must do it, but he did not realize what an effect it would have on a young girl. Only when, as he entered Kitty's room one evening before going to the theater, and saw her lovely face bathed in tears, and unhappy with the irreparable woe that he had caused, did he perceive the abyss that separated his shameful past from her dove-like purity, and he was horror-stricken at what he had done. "Take back these terrible papers! Take them back!" she said, pushing away the sheets lying on the table. "Why did you give them to me? However, perhaps it was for the best," she added, seized with pity at the sight of Levin's despairing face. "But it is terrible, terrible!" He hung his head and had nothing to say. "You will not forgive me," he murmured. "Yes, I have forgiven you, but it is terrible." However, his happiness was so immense that this confession did not diminish it, but only served to add a shade more to it. She forgave him. From that time he counted himself still more unworthy of her. Morally he bowed down still lower before her, and treasured the happiness that he had gained still higher. He understood the worth of it still better after this pardon. When he returned to his lonely room, Alexey Alexandrovitch involuntarily recalled, little by little, the conversations that had taken place at the dinner and in the evening. Darya Alexandrovna's words about pardon merely aroused his vexation. Whether he should apply the Christian rule to his case or not was a question too difficult to be lightly decided. Besides, he had already considered this question and decided it in the negative. Of all that had been said that day, the remark of that good stupid, Turotsuin, had made the liveliest impression on his mind. He did bravely, for he challenged the other man, and killed him." Evidently all approved this conduct, although out of politeness they had not said so openly. "However the matter is ended, it is useless to think about it," said Alexey Alexandrovitch to himself, and giving no more thought to anything except the preparations for his departure and his tour of inspection, he went to his room and asked the Swiss who showed him the way if he had seen his valet. The Swiss said his valet had only just gone out. Alexey Alexandrovitch ordered tea to be brought, and sitting down at the table opened a railway guide and began to study the departure of trains for his journey. "Two telegrams," said his valet, returning and coming into the room. "Will your Excellency please excuse me? I have only just stepped out." Alexey Alexandrovitch took the telegrams and opened them. The first announced the nomination of Stremov to the place for which he had been ambitious. Alexey Alexandrovitch threw down the dispatch, and with a flushed face began to walk back and forth through the room. "Quo vult perdere dementat," said he, applying quo to all those who had taken part in this nomination. He was not disturbed by the fact that he himself had not been nominated, that he had evidently been outwitted. But it was incomprehensible to him, amazing, that they could not see that Stremov, that babbler, that speechifier, was the least fitted of all men for the place. Could they not understand that they were ruining themselves, that they were destroying their prestige by such a choice? Some more news of the same sort, he thought, with bitterness as he opened the second telegram. It was from his wife. Her name, Anna, in blue pencil, was the first thing that struck his eyes. "I am dying. I beg you to come. I shall die easier if I have your forgiveness." He read these words with scorn and threw the paper on the floor. That there was some piece of trickery, some deception, in this, admitted of no doubt in his mind at first thought. There is no deceitfulness of which she is not capable. She must be on the eve of her confinement, and it is her sickness. But what can be her object? To legalize the child? To compromise me? To prevent the divorce? But what does it mean, "I am dying"? He reread the telegram, and suddenly realized its full meaning. If it is true, if the suffering, the approach of death, have caused her to repent sincerely, and if I should call this pretense, and refuse to go to her, that would not only be cruel, but foolish, and all would blame me. "Pyotr, order a carriage. I am going to Petersburg," said he to the valet. Alexey Alexandrovitch decided to go to Petersburg and to see his wife. If her illness was a pretense, he would say nothing and go away again. On the other hand, if she were really ill unto death, and wanted to see him before she died, he would forgive her, and, if he reached her too late, he could at least pay his last respects to her. During the journey he gave no more thought of what he should do. Alexey Alexandrovitch, tired and dusty with his night in the coach, reached Petersburg in the midst of the early morning. He rode along the still deserted Nevsky Prospect, looking straight before him, without thinking of what was awaiting him at home. He could not think about it, because as soon as he tried to imagine what might be, he could not drive away the suggestion that his wife's death would put a sudden end to all difficulties of his situation. The bakers, the closed shops, the night izvoschiks, the dvorniks sweeping the sidewalks, all passed like a flash before his eyes. He noticed everything, in his endeavors to stifle the thought of what was before him, of what he dared not hope for, and yet hoped for. He reached his house. An izvoshchik and a carriage with a coachman asleep were standing before the door. As he entered the vestibule, Alexey Alexandrovitch, as it were, snatched at a decision from the most hidden recess of his brain, and succeeded in mastering it. It was to this effect: "If she has deceived me, I will be calm and go away again. But if she has told the truth, I will do what is proper." The Swiss opened the door even before Alexey Alexandrovitch rang the bell. The Swiss Petrov, known as Kapitanuitch, presented a strange appearance, dressed in an old coat and slippers, without any cravat. "How is the Baroinya?" In the night there was a change for the better. Alexey Alexandrovitch stopped short and turned very pale. He now realized how deeply he had hoped for her death. "And how is she?" Karnai, the servant in morning dress, came quickly down the stairs. "Very low," he said. "There was a consultation yesterday, and the doctor is here now." "Take my things," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, a little comforted to learn that there was still hope of death, and he went into the reception room. A uniform overcoat hung in the hall. Alexey Alexandrovitch noticed it, and asked, "Who is here?" "The doctor, the nurse, and Count Vronsky." Alexey Alexandrovitch went through the inner rooms. There was no one in the drawing room, but the sound of his steps brought the nurse, in a cap with lilac ribbons, out of the boudoir. She came to Alexey Alexandrovitch and, taking him by the hand, with the familiarity that the approach of death permits, led him into the sleeping room. "Thank the Lord that you have come. She talks of nothing but you, always of you," she said. "Bring some ice, quick," said the imperative voice of the doctor from the chamber. Alexey Alexandrovitch went into her boudoir. On a little low chair by her table sat Vronsky weeping, his face covered with his hands. He started at the sound of the doctor's voice, uncovered his face, and saw Alexey Alexandrovitch. The sight of the husband disturbed him so much that he sat back in his chair, crouching his head down between his shoulders, as if he wanted to disappear out of sight. Then, making a great effort, he rose and said, "She is dying. The doctors say that there is no hope. I am in your power. Only allow me to remain here. I will conform to your wishes in every other respect. When he saw Vronsky in tears, Alexey Alexandrovitch felt the involuntary tenderness that the sufferings of others always caused him, and he turned away his head without replying, and went to the door. Anna's voice could be heard from the sleeping room, lively, gay, and with clear intonations. Alexey Alexandrovitch went in and approached her bed. She was lying with her face turned toward him. Her cheeks were bright red, her eyes brilliant. Her little white hands coming out of the sleeves of her nightdress were playing with the corner of the coverlet. Not only did she seem fresh and well, but in the happiest frame of mind. She talked fast and loud, accenting her words with precision and nicety. "Because Alexey, I am speaking of Alexey Alexandrovitch. Strange, isn't it? And cruel, that both should be named Alexey. Alexey would not have refused me. I should have forgotten. He would have forgiven. Yes, why does he not come? He is good. He himself does not know how good he is. Ah, Bose moi, what agony! Give me some water, quick. Ah, but that is not good for her, my little daughter. Well, then, very good. Give her to the nurse. I am willing, that she will be even better. Now when he comes, she will be hateful in his sight. Take her away." "Anna Arkadyevna, he has come. Here he is," said the nurse, trying to draw her attention to Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Oh, what nonsense!" continued Anna, without seeing her husband. "There, give the little one to me. Give her to me. He hasn't come yet. You pretend that he will not forgive me because you do not know him. No one knows him. I alone. His eyes. One must know them. Sir Rosa's are very like them. That is why I can no longer look at them. Has Sir Rosa had his dinner? I know he will be forgotten. Oh, do not forget him. Let Sir Rosa be brought into the corner chamber, and let Marietta sleep near him." Suddenly she shrank back and was silent, and, with a look of terror, raised her arms above her head as if to ward off a blow. She had recognized her husband. "No, no," she said quickly. "I am not afraid of him. I am afraid of dying. Alexey, come here. I am in a hurry, because there is no time to be lost. I have only a few minutes to live. The fever will be upon me again, and I shall know nothing more. Now I am conscious. I understand everything, and I see everything." Alexey Alexandrovitch's wrinkled face expressed acute suffering. He took her hand, and he wanted to speak, but his lower lip trembled so that he could not utter a word, and his emotion hardly allowed him to glance at the dying woman. Every time that he turned his head toward her, He saw her eyes fixed on him with a humility and enthusiastic affection which he had never seen there before. "Wait! You do not know! Wait! Wait!" She stopped to collect her thoughts. "Yes," she began again. "Yes, yes, yes. This is what I want to say. Do not be astonished. I am always the same. But there is another I within me. Her I fear. It is she who loved him, and hated you. And I could not forget what I had once been. That was not I. Now I am myself entirely, really myself, and not another. I am dying. I know that I am dying. Ask him if I am not. I feel it now. There are those terrible weights on my hand and my feet and on my fingers. My fingers! They are enormous. But all that will soon be over. One thing only is indispensable to me. Forgive me. Forgive me wholly. I am a sinner, but Serosa's nurse told me that there was a holy martyr. What was her name? Who was worse than I? I will go to Rome. There is a desert there. I shall not trouble anybody there. I will only take Serosa and my little daughter. No, you cannot forgive me. I know very well that it is impossible. Go away. Go away. You are too perfect." She held him with one of her burning hands and pushed him away with the other. Alexey Alexandrovitch's emotion had been all the time increasing, and now it reached such a degree that he could no longer control himself. He suddenly felt that what he had considered his spiritual discord was, on the contrary, a blessed state of the soul which imparted to him what seemed like a new and hitherto unknown happiness. He had not believed that the Christian law, which he had taken for a guide in life, ordered him to forgive and love his enemies. But now his soul was filled with joyous love and forgiveness to his enemies. He knelt beside the bed. He laid his forehead on her arm, the fever of which burned through the sleeve, and sobbed like a child. She bent toward him, placed her arm around her husband's bald head, and raised her eyes defiantly and proudly. "There, I knew that it would be so. Now farewell. Farewell all. They are coming back again. Why don't they go away? There, take off all these furs from me." The doctor disengaged her arms, laid her back gently on her pillows, and drew the covering over her. Anna made no resistance, looking all the while straight before her, with shining eyes. "Remember that I have only asked your pardon. I ask nothing more. Why doesn't he come?" she said, suddenly looking toward the door, toward Vronsky. "Come here and give me your hand." Vronsky came to the side of the bed and, when he saw Anna, he hid his face in his hands again. "Uncover your face. Look at him. He is a saint," said she. "Yes. Uncover your face. Look at him," she repeated in an irritated manner. "Alexey Alexandrovitch, uncover his face. I want to see him." Alexey Alexandrovitch took Vronsky's hands and uncovered his face, disfigured by the expression of suffering and humiliation which it wore. "Give him your hand. Forgive him." Alexey Alexandrovitch held out his hand to him, without trying to keep back the tears. "Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord," said she. "Now everything is right. I will stretch out my feet a little like that. That is better. How ugly those flowers are. They do not look like violets," she said, pointing to the hangings in her room. "Bose moi, when will this be over? Give me some morphine, doctor, some morphine. Bose moi. And she tossed about on the bed. The doctor said that this was perpetual fever, and that there was not one chance in 100 of her living. All that day there was fever, with alleviations of delirium and unconsciousness. Toward midnight she lay unconscious, and her heart had almost ceased to beat. The end was expected every moment. Vronsky went home, but he came back the next morning to learn how she was. Alexey Alexandrovitch came to meet him in the reception room and said to him, "Stay, perhaps she will ask for you." Then he himself took him to his wife's boudoir. In the morning the restlessness, the rapidity of thought and speech returned, but soon unconsciousness intervened again. The third day was much the same, and the doctors began to hope. On this day Alexey Alexandrovitch went to the boudoir where Vronsky was, closed the door, and sat down in front of him. "Alexey Alexandrovitch," said Vronsky, feeling that an explanation was at hand, "I cannot speak. I cannot think. Have pity on me. Hard as it may be for you, believe me, it is still more terrible for me." He was going to rise, but Alexey Alexandrovitch prevented him, and said, "Pray listen to me. It is unavoidable. I am forced to explain to you the feelings that guide me, and will continue to guide me, that you may avoid making any mistake in regard to me. You know that I have decided on a divorce, and that I have taken preliminary steps to obtain one. I will not deny that at first I was undecided. I was in torment. I confess that the desire to avenge myself on you and on her pursued me. When I received the telegram, I came home. I felt the same desire. I will say more. I wished for her death. But—" He was silent for a moment, considering whether he would wholly reveal his thoughts. "But I have seen her, and I have forgiven her. The happiness I feel at being able to forgive clearly shows me my duty. I have absolutely forgiven her. I desire to offer the other cheek to the smiter. I wish to give my cloak to him who has robbed me of my coat. I only ask one thing of God, that he will not take away from me this joy of forgiving." Tears filled his eyes. Vronsky was amazed at the calm, luminous face. "This is my position. You may drag me in the mire, and make me the laughing stock of creation, but I will not give up Anna for that, nor will I utter a word of reproach to you," continued Alexey Alexandrovitch. "My duty seems clear and plain to me. I must remain with her. I shall remain with her. If she wishes to see you, I shall inform you of it. But now I think it will be better for you to go away." He rose. Sobs choked his voice. Vronsky rose too, and, standing with bowed head and humble attitude, looked up at Karenin without a word to say. He was incapable of understanding Alexey Alexandrovitch's feelings, but he felt that this was something too high for him, something even unapproachable for a person who looked on the world as he did.